the owner in the direction of the fact that we are retaining small business rates relief, the fact that we are freezing the small business multiplier next year, and of course that we are extending retail, hospitality and leisure relief in 25-26. I would also point the owner of that business and indeed other businesses to our future plans, as I mentioned, to have permanently lower tax rates for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses with rateable values below £500,000, as well as looking at reforms to small business rates relief to better support businesses who want to expand into a second premises.
Steve Darling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd be grateful if the Minister could advise the Chamber what consideration they have given to exempting the seasonal tourist industry from the national insurance hikes this summer that are set to kick in. This would particularly benefit Paynton Zoo and Splashdown in the Torbay constituency.
I thank the honourable member for his question, but as he will know, we've set out the details of our decision to increase the rate of national insurance contributions from employers and to reduce the threshold, and we've added as well the different benefit that we will give particularly to small businesses and charities by more than doubling the employment allowance. The employers' national insurance contributions changes were amongst the toughest that we took in the budget, but they were necessary to repair the public finances and deliver the economic stability which is so crucial for investment and growth.
We've had the former, let's have the present Chair of the Finance Committee, Dame McGillian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend rightly said that SMEs are a very vital part of our high streets and our economy. And one of the big changes, of course, is the change to business rates. And he wasn't going to be tempted in the Select Committee last week to give more detail on the time frame. But many businesses are really wanting that certainty about business rates as they go forward. So could I tempt him just to give an indication of the government's thinking about how quickly this might be introduced and whether the small business rate relief is likely to survive or be subsumed into a new regime?
Well, I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for her questions, and if she didn't succeed in tempting me at the Select Committee, I doubt she's going to succeed today. But I can reassure her that the decisions we've set out about introducing the permanently lower rates of business rates for RHL properties below £500,000 rateable value will be coming in from April 2026. And specifically in relation to small business rates relief, I can confirm the government is committed to retaining that. And in fact, one of the options we're looking at in our Transforming Business Rates discussion paper is about how to support businesses who want to expand into a second premises, thereby growing the business, because at the moment there's a cliff edge in them losing the small business rates relief.
We come to Shadow Minister Richard Fuller.
Confidence on Britain's high streets is sliding faster than the Chancellor will be down the ski slopes of Davos later today. So, with retail sales down rather than up as expected in the run-up to Christmas, and with the British Retail Consortium saying 2/3 of stores will raise prices to cover her national insurance increases, when will the Minister accept that the Chancellor's strategy of raising taxes and increasing regulations is an economic strategy that is not working?
Well, I'm glad to know the Shadow Minister's morning was well spent cooking up that Davos line about the ski slopes. But you know, look, what he will know, and what sectors across the economy will know, is that having a stable economy is a prerequisite for the investment we need to get the economy growing. And that is why we had to take difficult decisions at the autumn budget, including those to increase the rate of employers' national insurance contributions. Alongside that increase, however, we more than doubled the employment allowance, and we set out our plans to have permanently lower tax rates for high street RHL properties from April 2026.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of small high street businesses are going to be hit hard by the government's jobs tax and the dramatic reduction in business rates relief. And House of Commons Library research which I've commissioned shows that from April 2026, the government's reforms to business rates could leave small and independent businesses effectively subsidising the big chains. So will the Chancellor meet with me and a delegation of small and independent businesses from St Albans so we can make the case for fairer reforms and for wholesale reform of the broken business rate system?
Mr. Speaker, one of the problems with the Liberal Democrats is that they support all of our spending plans, but they don't support any of the tax changes to fund them. And this is a prime example of this. When we're talking about increasing employer national insurance contributions, we acknowledge that was one of the toughest decisions we took at the budget, but it was necessary to fix the public finances and provide support for those public services, which I note they're very keen to support themselves.
Frank McNally.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I became Chancellor, there was a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. We simply couldn't carry on like that, which is why I have taken control of our public finances and made growth the #1 priority of this government to improve living standards. In December, I launched the second phase of our spending review, where for the first time in 17 years, every single pound of taxpayer money will be investigated line by line to ensure that it is being spent well. The spending review will set resource or day-to-day departmental budgets until 2028-29 and capital departmental budgets until 2029-2030. On the 11th of June, when we conclude the review, I will present departmental budgets to the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The recent drop in the rate of inflation is welcome news for those facing financial pressures across Coatbridge and Bellshill, as is the expectation that the UK will become the fastest growing economy in Europe. What further action is my right honourable friend taking, working in partnership with Cabinet colleagues, to ensure that working families continue to see prices fall and living standards rise?
Thank my honourable friend for that question, and I know that the cost of living has a deep impact on all of our constituents, including in Coatbridge and Bellshill. Like the honourable member, my honourable friend, I was pleased to see the reduction in inflation last week, and the Bank of England's independence is sacrosanct to carry on those efforts. In addition, we increased the minimum wage in the budget, we've reformed universal credit to reduce deductions and extended the household support fund, all to help ensure working families have more money in their pockets.
Chancellor Millstride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Right Honourable Lady spoke a moment ago about the importance of spending money wisely. So could I ask her, in light of the Treasury Select Committee's conclusion that her new Office for Value for Money is a waste of money, would she agree that one of its early actions should be to abolish itself in order to save money?
I was pleased to appoint Tom Hayhoe to run the Office for Value for Money, somebody who's got a track record of delivering value for money for taxpayers. What this government wants to scrap is giving contracts to friends and donors, because that was a colossal waste of money instigated by the party opposite.
Millstride.
The Chancellor's answer was an answer, but I don't think it actually connected in any way with my question. So could I perhaps now ask her about national insurance hikes? Mr. Speaker, a full 2/3 of the revenues raised through Labour's job tax is simply going on servicing the additional debt being run up by this profligate government. Given this, does the Chancellor really believe that the catastrophic effects of this tax on businesses right up and down this country is a price worth paying?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We inherited a £22 billion black hole in the public finances, and we set out the detail of that at the time of the budget. It was absolutely essential to close that gap, to bring stability back to the public finances. That required difficult decisions, but they were the right decisions to ensure that our country has the stability that it lacked for so many years under so many different Prime Ministers and Chancellors under the party opposite.
Steve Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency in Mansfield has more members of the British Coal Staff Superannuation Scheme than any other constituency in the country. Can the Chief Secretary therefore outline the process and the questions that need to be satisfied in order to release the Investment Reserve Fund to the surviving beneficiaries of the scheme?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this issue, which is clearly of importance to him and his constituents. As I've confirmed to the House today, the Minister for Trade in the Department for Business and Trade is working with the trustees of the BECSS scheme to consider options. I will meet with the Minister in due course to look at those and provide further updates to the House in due course.
Glover.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Local Government Association estimates that the budget's increases to employer national insurance contributions will cost local councils an extra £637 million per year. The government's funding settlement for them in relation to that of £515 million will leave them with a gap, putting key services like social care, pothole repairs and leisure facilities at risk. Yep. Will the Chancellor commit to fully funding that gap for local councils rather than them having to look for savings themselves?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, during the passage of the bill increasing the rates of employer national insurance, we set out very clearly how the scheme would work in terms of reimbursing public departments or local government for their costs. In fact, it's a measure in line very much with how the previous government attempted to do it, the health and social care levy, where third-party contractors, private contractors are engaged, and those costs will be considered by local government or other public sector organisations in the round.
Brian Leishman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The previous Conservative government decided to back an INEOS project in Antwerp with a £600 million loan guarantee. I have spoken with the current Secretary of State and Government Minister about this, and I've been told that the government has no plans to stop this money, even though INEOS planned to close the Grangemouth refinery and thousands of jobs will be lost. Why is there £600 million for Antwerp and not Grangemouth? And why would the government allow this to happen and not use the £600 million as leverage with INEOS in order to avoid Scottish job losses?
This government can't account for the decisions made by the party opposite, but we have created an Office for Value for Money to make sure that we always get value for money when we use taxpayers' money.
Right, Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking as someone actively involved in a number of businesses, unlike the majority of the front bench, I've spent far too much of my life trying to communicating with HMRC. I am not alone. Taxpayers cumulatively spent 798 years on hold with HMRC in 2022-3, with letters often going unanswered for months. When the phone is picked up, decent British taxpayers and their advisers are increasingly being treated like criminals by arrogant, petty, unaccountable bureaucrats. Will the Chancellor today commit to a comprehensive review of HMRC to make them as accountable to the taxpayer as the taxpayer is to them, starting with answering the first...
Mr. Lowell, please. It's topicals. They're meant to be short and punchy, and I'm sure you're very good at that normally. Right. Who's answering, Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my key priorities as Exchequer Secretary and the Minister with responsibility for HMRC is to oversee a programme of transformation of HMRC to improve its customer service, to digitise the service, to close the tax gap and to make sure we have the modern reform service we need for the future.
Steve Withenden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw members' attention to my declaration in the Register of All Party Parliamentary Groups. 3.8 million self-employed UK taxpayers were shamefully excluded from government financial support during COVID-19 pandemic, with many, including pregnant women and war veterans, forgotten about by the party opposite. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss how we can address the unfairness faced by so many during the pandemic?
Well, thank my honourable friend for his question. And as he set out, decisions on the eligibility for COVID-19 financial support were taken by the previous government. The current government currently has no plans to assess or pursue a financial compensation scheme, but I note the COVID-19 inquiry has recently launched its module investigating the economic response to the pandemic, and the government is committed to learning from the inquiry's findings.
When I visited St Barnabas Hospice in Lincoln recently, the Chief Executive told me he was having to pay £350,000 every year now extra to cover the national insurance increase. I don't expect an answer now, but as we all agree that palliative care is so important and we want to encourage it, and the committee bill started today, will the government keep this increase under review in terms of hospices?
I thank the honourable member for his question. The Health Secretary set out the settlement for hospices just before Christmas to ensure that hospices have got the money that they need, including to compensate for the increase in national insurance. But I'm very happy to arrange a meeting for the honourable member with the relevant minister in the Department for Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On New Year's Day, hundreds of my constituents woke up not to hangovers and warm homes, but to floodwater rushing into their houses. I watched as families and young children were pulled from their homes in Plattbridge, alongside flooding in Ashton and Bickershaw. I welcome the government's £2.4 billion committed to flood defence schemes, But can I ask the Minister if he will commit to protecting funding for flood victims and flood defence schemes in the future?
Minister, welcome to the debate.
My honourable friend is a powerful advocate for his constituents, and particularly for those that have suffered in recent weeks, including others actually across Greater Manchester. As I said earlier, the government has put in £2.4 billion to ensure flood resilience over the next 2 years. As he'll be well aware, future decisions on flood funding will be taken in the spending review in the normal way, but I know he'll continue to be a powerful advocate for his constituents.
Tim Farron.
Mr. Speaker, schools in Westmoreland have been told that they will have to meet, at least in part, the cost of teacher pay rises next year from within existing funds and by making efficiencies. Doesn't the Chancellor understand that all that's available to schools in my constituency is to sack teachers and to merge classes? Will she instead then commit to fully fund the teachers' pay rise and other cost increases so our schools can do the job they are meant to do?
The honourable member knows that it's important that in order to restore public finances and put them on a firm foundation, departmental settlements have to reflect the cost of the civil servants that they employ. That's how the departments are working, but as the Chancellor has previously confirmed, the Department for Education has received money in order to cover the cost of running the education system, and those details will be provided to schools in the normal way in due course.
Jill Jam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State for Transport, the Secretary of State for Wales, the Chair of the Welsh Affairs Committee and Welsh Government all went on record last week recognising the low level of spending on rail infrastructure in Wales by the previous government. Does my right honourable friend agree with them and with me that this government must put this underinvestment right and ensure me that the Treasury recognises the crucial part our railways play in economic growth in Wales?
I thank my honourable friend, who's an important champion for the voice of the Welsh economy. Wales can and will play an important part in our growth mission. Our two Labour governments continue to work together as we review the position inherited from the previous government, including on rail infrastructure, and decisions will be set out at the spending review in June.
Alex Easton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Chancellor advise businesses in my constituency who are having to make staff unemployed to pay for the employment and national insurance increases, and also having to stop expansion plans because of her rises?
Mr. Speaker, as we've been clear throughout the budget and the period since then, the decision to raise employer national insurance contributions was one of the toughest decisions we've taken as government, and we recognise it has consequences for businesses. What we think all businesses will benefit from in future is the economic stability which it brings, which will drive investment and growth across the country.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating Intersight, a technology business in Stockton that's celebrating its 10th anniversary with 40% growth? And does she agree with me that our industrial strategy will help businesses to invest and grow in Teesside?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I join him in congratulating Intersight on their 10th anniversary as a business and the rapid growth that they are enjoying. The announcement that we were able to make as a government last year about the carbon capture and storage work in Teesside will be a big driver of jobs and growth in that part of the country, and I look forward to him working with him and local businesses in Stockton in making that a reality.
Oliver Dowden.
Does the Chancellor of the Exchequer propose to fund the reported £9 billion bill for the continued use of Diego Garcia to the Mauritians through higher taxes, through more borrowing, or through spending cuts?
Chancellor.
We are in discussions with the new administration in the United States around the future of Diego Garcia, and we'll set out details in the spending review, as you would expect.
Debbie Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's estimated that 148,000 people had their lives cut short between 2010 and 2020 as a result of austerity measures. And then on top of this, this poor health led to over £13 billion in lost productivity under the previous government. What are my right honourable friends' estimates of the different choices and the impact that they will have on the health of the nation, but also on economic growth?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I know that she closely studies work of Professor Michael Marmot on life expectancy and the impact of health inequalities on our country. At the budget, we increased the minimum wage, and in addition, we extended the Household Support Fund, reduced the amount that could be taken deductions from universal credit, all to try and put more money in the pockets of ordinary working people to reduce some of those inequalities and tackle the cost of living crisis.
Mr. Speaker, one of my GP surgeries called me this morning to highlight the impact of the national insurance contribution rises on them. It's going to cost them £40,000. Their only response is they're going to have to freeze pay, cost of living pay increases for all their support staff. So does she finally accept that working people up and down the country are paying the prices for her tax rises?
Mr. Speaker, what we accept is that the difficult decisions we took at the budget enabled extra funding to be put into the NHS as a result of those difficult decisions having been taken. The GP surgeries have had a funding settlement which considers all the pressures on them in the round.
Rudakubana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency of Dudley has a proud industrial heritage, with manufacturing still worth £1 billion a year to the local economy from sectors that account for nearly 10% of the UK's total economic output. What steps has the government taken to promote the growth of the manufacturing sector and ensure that towns like Dudley continue to build on their industrial heritages?
I thank my honourable friend for that question and the work that she does to support and promote businesses in Dudley. Our modern industrial strategy and the targeting of 8 sectors where there's huge potential for growth will ensure that we work with businesses right across the country to do things like reform the planning system to make it easier for them to build, and reform the pension system to get funding for businesses looking to grow and expand, including businesses in Dudley.
Dave Dugan.
Mr. Speaker, neither the Federal Reserve nor the EU Central Bank are engaged in active quantitative tightening, but the Bank of England is. And the Bank of England is costing the public finances in the region of £13 billion a year by a fire sale of UK government bonds. Last time I spoke to the Chancellor about this, she said that's because of the Bank of England's operational independence, which we all value, but it's not a licence for impunity. So what discussions will she have with the Bank of England about releasing UK government debt in a way that benefits everybody in the UK?
It's our view that it's absolutely right that the Bank of England has operational independence. This is in line with international standards and indeed in jurisdictions around the world, including in the United States and the Eurozone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent developments in the UK investment trust sector has once again shone a light about the crucial role that retail investors play in our financial markets. In her Mansion House speech last November, the Chancellor rightly prioritised leveraging domestic pension capital to drive the government's economic growth mission. But does the Minister agree with me that greater retail participation in UK financial markets also supports growth and democratises wealth? And will she meet with me to discuss how government can better support access to financial markets for individuals, including in my Buckingham Bletchley constituency?
Always happy to meet with my honourable friend who is a near neighbour. We absolutely agree that retail investment is crucial, and I want to see more progress on the advice, guidance, boundary and targeted support, and I will be working closely in my new role with the FCA to take that forward.
Final question, Sarah Olney.
Mr. Speaker, residents in my constituency of Richmond Park will have been extremely concerned to read the news this morning that the Chancellor plans to announce next week the expansion of Heathrow. I'd like to invite her to tell us, yes or no, on the floor of the House this morning, whether or not the government backs expansion at Heathrow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to comment on leaks, but what I would say is this government are absolutely committed to growing our economy and making this a great place for businesses to invest and trade in.
Right, that completes questions. We'll let the front bench change over. Right, let us come to the urgent question. David Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the government if it will make a statement on community engagement principles and extremism.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
National security will always come first for this government, and we will always treat the threat of extremism with the seriousness it requires. And as the Prime Minister set out this morning, Britain now faces a new threat. A threat of extreme violence by individuals driven by material online, often now represented by single individuals who are driven by a twisted desire for notoriety. And this is a threat that we must contend with alongside that from traditional terrorist groups. And the House will be aware that the Home Secretary will be making a statement to this House shortly this afternoon. And all of this changing threat will be considered as part of the Home Secretary's rapid review, as ordered last year, which will inform this government's counter-extremism strategy. This review is considering the current understanding of extremism, including Islamist and far-right extremism, and will include focus on how best to tackle the threat posed by extremist ideologies online and offline. The early findings from this work were set out in December alongside initial measures to tackle the challenges we face. The Home Office will provide a further update on the measures and actions arising from the counter-extremism sprint shortly. With regards to MHCLG, our department, we retain responsibilities for communities and cohesion policy. The Deputy Prime Minister has convened a new cross-government communities recovery steering group to develop a comprehensive strategy to address the underlying causes of divisions in our local communities. In particular, this is seeking to address some of the causes that drove disorder across the UK following the Southport tragedy this summer. We have made clear that a new approach is urgently needed, and we've backed this with an initial £50 million of funding via the MHCLG Community Recovery Fund to support places impacted over the summer.
Shadow Minister Davidson.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. This question relates to the announcement by Michael Gove, who was then Secretary of State last March, when he set out some new definitions of extremism, including Islamist and far-right groups, and robust non-engagement principles for government, where there were serious concerns. It's particularly relevant in this MHCLG portfolio because for organisations such as social services, youth justice, Prevent, where public services are engaging at a community level with a variety of different organisations to gather intelligence, to support people to move away from extremism, and to intervene and disrupt, for example, emerging challenges such as grooming gangs. And it's also particularly important for our often vilified Muslim community, who contribute so much to our nation. The aim of those principles was to set out a new system for structured engagement. However, in July, the Chancellor announced £120 million of savings within the department from small projects. It subsequently emerged in written questions that an element of this is reduced funding for legal fees, which are no longer expected to arise from the previous government's cross-party approach to extremism. Since then, a series of questions have found it very challenging to determine exactly what this means. However, ministers have now told the House in answer to written questions that this statement reflects the fact that the government has chosen, in effect, to ditch the last government's policy on non-engagement and these principles. So the questions I'd like to put to the Minister, I'm very conscious this is very sensitive given the Southport statement, which we will be hearing later on about that specific case. But can he tell the House, does the Department still adhere to that working definition of Islamism? Does the Department still have a working definition of non-violent extremism that public bodies can rely on should they need to defend themselves if challenged? Can he tell the House why ministers have not been, to quote the Ministerial Code, as open as possible on this issue? And will he share with the House details of correspondence at any meetings that have taken place, and in particular the membership of the steering group that he referred to, so there is a higher degree of transparency and confidence around this process?
Minister.
I'm grateful for the initial question and for that follow-up one. I don't think it would be a revelation to colleagues across the House that a change of government often means a change of approach to what have been shared views and shared problems in the past. You know, I believe that the previous government deeply wanted to tackle extremism in all its forms across the country. We share that. Where we differ is in the approach taken by the department. Previously, as was subject to the written ministerial statement last year, and this is, I have to say something that I simply cannot agree with. The previous Secretary of State, for whom I have a lot of respect, chose to assume a lot of responsibility, essentially for the entire government within MHCLG. I think there's very good reasons why that isn't the right approach, because actually, counter-extremism, I believe, should be the fundamental purview of the Home Office, not least because of the access to often confidential information that they get that MHCLG doesn't. So the approach we've chosen as a new government is for a cross-government but Home Office-led counter-extremism sprint that's going to lead to a counter-extremism strategy in due course to shape the government's way forward. That is a different approach to what is, I believe, a commonly understood problem. I can't accept the Honourable Gentleman's characterisation that the previous process was particularly robust. Let's be honest, it was not used. You know, the Secretary of State set out, the previous Secretary of State set out a flourishing written ministerial statement with a system that could have led. He named some organisations, but was very clear. It was very clear in the written ministerial statement that that was not prejudging any process for those organisations, and subsequently did not use that process. So I would question attachment to a previous process that the previous government chose not to use. On the point of openness, I've answered multiple questions from the Secretary of State, from the Shadow Minister, Shadow Secretary of State, the Shadow Minister. I'll continue to do so. Obviously, we have the opportunity to do as well, so we will be as open as we possibly can be. And similarly, with regards to the steering group, I don't think we have made that public, but I'm sure there's no problem in doing so, and I'll make sure that that's available.
Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Session-Lumley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think at a time when we are seeing such an increase in religious hate crime, including Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, we all have a duty in this House to be careful around the language we use. And I hope that the government will also look at the language coming out from the government, because it's really vital for community cohesion that we are careful and we don't unintendedly inflame this. There are some really critical issues going on, not just in this country, but around the world. But can the Minister outline that in looking at the definition and changing anything in place by the previous government, that the Minister will outline whether the government will consult on any new definition, which, if we're honest and we look back and, you know, following the Minister's response, the lack of consultation by the previous government.
Minister.
I'm grateful for that question from the Chair of the Select Committee. I think the point on language is an important one. I think it is reasonable and right that our constituents would expect us to be robust where those who choose to challenge and undermine democracy and those basic principles that guide our society, but also that we use our platform, our very privileged platform, not to give rise and not to give succour for hateful ideas and prejudices. And indeed, that's one of the things we know of the changing nature of terror, is that those individuals are taking cues from organisations themselves that are stopping short of an obvious threshold of inflaming terrorist-type behaviours, but that instead are using that as encouragement. I think we all have a responsibility, therefore, to be very measured in that. With regards to the engagement for the Home Office, we will want to make sure that anything that comes out of the cross-government sprint and then into the strategy is one that communities across the country can buy into, can have ownership from. So, of course, there will be engagement in that regard.
The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we know, the world is a fast-moving, scary place, and we know that people who feel disempowered and isolated are often turning to the internet. They're often very vulnerable people, and their reliance on the internet for everything in their world puts them at even greater risk. So we must work with our community leaders to make the most of the information they hold and get early notice of the problems. What worries me is the risk of authoritarian decision-making that affects all of us if we make these assumptions we don't actually work with our communities. So what consultation with communities has been taken around these changes, and what additional burdens might fall on local authorities in terms of changes to how the government works? And furthermore, with such extreme things taking place online, especially with our social media giants across the pond, what's the government doing actively to unite faith and cultural leaders, environmental groups with industries and across generations to foster unity and stop extremism across the whole spectrum?
I'm grateful for that question. I mean, I share a lot with what the Honourable Lady says in terms of earlier interventions and tackling isolation at its root. I think, as she says, local authorities are really important partners in that. That's why we'll ensure that whatever comes out of our Communities and Recovery Steering Group leans into that partnership of local authority, of course local law enforcement where possible, to make sure that those right resources and support are in place. And she asked about engagement, and she asked about making sure we have a contribution from those who would be affected in terms of across our faith communities. My honourable friend from the other place, the Noble Lord Khan, the Faith Minister, has met with representatives of all faiths, and it will continue to do so, to keep having that exact dialogue. And it's important between the government and different faith groups, so that we are making sure that the ideas that we bring forward are going to be effective and are rooted in real life, but also as a real promotion of interfaith work, as she talks about. Because actually I know from my own community that when we've had challenges, the best thing we've had to lean on is that interfaith relationship across faith to tackle hate wherever it might emerge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is real division in our communities, and extremism is changing at great speed. And I know that the vast majority of members in this House treat such division as a tragedy and something that needs to be solved calmly. However, there are some, sadly, who appear to view it as a political opportunity. Does he agree with me that members in this place need to be calm in their dialogue on this issue, and where they are not should be called out by all political parties?
Minister.
Well, I've always felt that there's two types of politicians. There's ones who seek to move things forward politically by bringing people together, and those who seek to exploit division. And it's up to individual members, honourable members, to decide which of which is their personal approach. When it happens in political parties and where there is divisive or bordering on hateful language, we would expect them to resolve that in their normal ways. But we are, certainly with regards to leadership of this country, we're the luckiest people in the country. We get to come here every day and to take these issues head on in the interest of our community, in the interest of our country. And I think almost exclusively the case, I see members use that platform for good. We may have very important distinctions and differences. That's great in a democracy, but we want to bring the country together, and we want to move the country forward together. And I think that's certainly the approach that I will be using.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister reassure the House in terms of the approach in terms of the Muslim Council for Britain? There is very real reasons as to why the last government decided to break off engagement with the MCB because of the infiltration that had happened in that organisation. And can the Minister say to the House that he and his government will not be engaging with it?
Well, I, like all my ministerial colleagues in department, and like all ministers from the Prime Minister and across the government, it is a matter of public record who we meet with, and that can be interrogated in its right way. I'm going to stop short of a running commentary organisation by organisation around who we won't meet, because, as I say, I'm not going to provide a running commentary on that organisation. We know the previous. As I say, it is very clear for the matter of record who I do and don't meet with.
Debbie Abrahams.
Mr. Speaker, I was a little bit concerned about the conflation of extremism by the Shadow Minister and child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs there. And does my my honourable friend agree with me that the importance of using our language, but not only that, but how we use our language is really important to avoid eradicating or the social cohesion that many of us have spent many years establishing in our communities.
Minister. I think it is important that we're careful in our language. I think it's important we're careful with conflations. And one thing I know about many years of building trust in my community is it takes a long time to build that trust, but it can be lost very quickly as well if we are thoughtless in the language that we use.
So Desmond Sway.
When a crime has the attributes of a terrorist outrage, but the police, in their engagement with the community, proactively announce that it's not initially being treated as such, isn't it bound to give rise to a public suspicion that the truth is being covered up?
Minister.
I mean, I don't know what particularly the honourable gentleman is referring to. But But you didn't have to use coded language if it did mean a specific incident. But what I would say it is rightly there is a distinction between what the government of the day does and what the police do, and we're not there to direct the police. But I know that all public bodies, in line with what I've said, need to be careful about the language they do because it has real-world consequences.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members across the House will know how important community engagement is to building strong communities, and working together with those whose views we may not share but we can respect is really important. And I want to pay tribute to the fantastic work of the Bracknell Forest Interfaith Forum in doing exactly that in my community. The party opposite, when in government, cut funding to the interfaith network, working at a national level. So I want to ask the Minister, what can we do to support organisations like the Bracknell Forest Interfaith Forum to bring religious groups together and understand that we do indeed have more in common than that which divides us?
Yes, I think there was a real sadness that the previous government moved away from interfaith as a model. My honourable friend, the Faith Minister, has been very clear of how important he thinks it is, and that's why promoting interfaith work has been a real core part of the work that he's done so far.
Kirsty Black.
Mr. Speaker, we know that a number of the individuals who are radicalised find that radicalisation and are encouraged to do so by platforms on the dark web, high-risk platforms. Will the Minister and the Home Secretary ensure that they work together with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport to ensure that the Online Safety Act does as it was intended to do, which is to regulate those high-risk platforms, rather than the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport just allowing Ofcom to step away from that and let them do what they like?
Well, I would share the intent of the Honourable Lady. We know that whether it's in publicly available online forums or whether it's in the dark web, there are people who will use all corners of the internet in order to promote their views and to promote hateful ideologies. As part of our counter-extremism sprint and the strategy that will follow from that, we're looking very carefully about this and the tools that we need to use in order to tackle it.
Colin Dace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will all be sadly familiar with the shocking and racist remarks made by Conservative Party donor Frank Hester last year. Now, I do not intend to repeat them in this House so that we don't have to relive them. But does the Minister agree with me that this kind of language encourages extremism and has no place in our politics?
Minister.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have to be careful, both as individuals and collectively within our parties, about the individuals with which we choose to associate, with whom perhaps we choose to take money from, in order to make sure that we're not sending messages that I don't think would be the messages we want to send.
Mark Blitchard.
Review, perhaps he can give the House a timetable. And part of that review, could he include the Charity Commission and ask what charities might be dividing our communities rather than unifying our communities? And finally, could there be more members of the cabinet, officials from the Cabinet Office and Home Office seconded to his department in order that decisions around Prevent and this review are taken in a better way?
Well, with regards to the strategy and its development particularly, I don't want to preempt the Home Secretary because I'm conscious that she's making the next statement. With regards to the point on Cabinet Office resourcing and secondments, I think the House would expect, and we would make the commitment that fundamentally we are one government, and we have to find those internal ways to work effectively. But come what may, we will not hide behind those as excuses for why things aren't effective. Instead, when ministers like myself ask questions, we'll address them in the spirit of one government.
Dr. Luca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I commend both sides of the House on this statement and the way in which they've respectfully approached this, because that's really, really important. The Minister did talk about the robustness of this topic, and I'm really keen to pick him up on that, because on one tenet in the UK is all about safety. The other is freedom of speech. So can the government rule out changing any definitions that could lead either intentionally or unintentionally towards blaspheme laws, because free speech is really important?
I mean, again, the Home Secretary will have the chance to talk about the counter-extreme strategy in due course, but to give assurance to the honourable gentleman, we've been looking at what the early signs from that review have been, as have been talked about in December by my honourable friend the Security Minister, were around the places in which hate fester rather than legislative changes to some degree.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Today, of course, with the families of those 3 poor little girls and everybody hurt in the terrible event last summer. And it is inexcusable that state agencies missed vital opportunities to intervene in this devastating case, including, of course, 3 crucial points following prevent referrals. These failings shine a grim light on the significant cracks in our public services following years of spending cuts and underinvestment. Will he join me in calling for the public inquiry to consider the role of austerity since 2010 as a contributing factor to these terrible failings?
Again, I'm afraid I can't preempt what the Home Secretary is about to say, and the Honourable Lady will have the chance to put that point to her. I will say that in our community strategy and our attempts to ensure that communities are resilient ones where people can live together in harmony, we are considering, of course, what was said in the Dame Sarah Khan review, of which one of the underlying causes that she raises concerns with was austerity. We need to make sure we've got well-resourced public services. We need to make sure that people don't feel that there is a division and an allocation of resources that in some way is targeted against them. We know that that should never be the case and would never be the case. So, of course, we're considering that as part of our community's work.
Katie Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The independent review of Prevent, the government programme that tries to stop people being radicalised by extremist views, said on its very first page, and I quote, "The facts clearly demonstrate that the most lethal threat in the last 20 years has come from Islamism, and this threat continues. The last government knew this to be true. Does this one?"
Minister.
Well, this government has taken on the independent review of Prevent. I know that 33 out of 34 of those recommendations have been implemented. We are engaged in the counter-extremism sprint that we are. Counter-extremism strategy will flow from that, and the Honourable Lady will have a chance to see that.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to have a go at getting an answer from the Minister, even if he doesn't answer the questions from my right honourable friends from the world of Kent and from Stone, Great Worley and Penkridge. Yesterday, his department confirmed in an FOI answer that there is internal government correspondence about the Muslim Council of Britain that it refuses to publish. Can the Minister overturn that decision, publish the papers and confirm that there have been no discussions and no correspondence within Whitehall proposing re-engagement with the MCB?
I can assure the honourable gentleman that the position has not moved. I've stated in written questions previously that we aren't meeting with Muslim. But again, well, I'm not sure I can say it any more clearly than in the dispatch box of the Chamber of the House of Commons. The position's not changed from the previous government.
Jim Shine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his answers to all of the questions? In Northern Ireland, of course, we've faced extremism from left and right. At the same time, we've managed to have community engagement as part of that, and I believe lessons can be learnt. It is essential that our police forces have the wherewithal to deal with threats in an appropriate mechanism. Therefore, the designation of community and extremism threats is truly essential. So will the Minister outline if the process of designation can be streamlined to ensure the police have all the powers that they need to work within communities, to root out and deal with paramilitaries and extremists with the safeguards for human rights? Thank you.
I am grateful for the honourable gentleman's question. I know that his particular work around the persecution of Christians across the world actually reads across to some of the challenges that he talks about in terms of making sure that we have cohesive communities across the UK. Of course, policing is a devolved matter, so perhaps it's slightly different for a minister in the UK Parliament today. But what I will assure him is that we do give the best insight to public institutions to make sure they are interacting in the best way possible. I do often feel for, say, junior officers early on in their service having to deal with what are often quite complicated issues in live time. So we want to make sure that they get the best information so they are able to do so.
That completes the UQ. Before we come to the Home Secretary's statement, I want to say that I appreciate that it's been one of the most frustrating periods for the House that we've not been able to discuss the issues relating to this case because of ongoing prosecutions. Although the case is still technically sub judice until sentencing on Thursday, given that the accused has pleaded guilty to all charges and the strong public interest in the House being able to discuss these matters, I am granting a waiver so that members may discuss it freely. While I am confident the House sub judice resolution has been followed correctly, I am grateful to the members for their patience in not discussing this case substantially before now. I am now going to ensure that the House sub judice resolution is revived and reviewed to ensure that it is fit for purpose ongoing. I now call the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll make a statement on the Southport murders. None of us will ever forget the events of 29th of July. The school holidays had just started. Little girls were at a dance class to have fun, to dance, to sing. A moment of joy turned into the darkest of nightmares. And we think especially of three little girls, Elsie Dot Stankham, B.B. King, and Alice De Silva Aguiar. Their precious smiles and the dreams that their families had. And we think of their families' agony to have that future so brutally destroyed. They are in all our hearts and prayers, as are those who survived the attack but who live with the physical and emotional scars. And nothing will ever take away their trauma and loss, and we will ensure that they receive the support and care they need in the years to come. We think too of the police and first responders who ran into that scene of unspeakable horror. The courage they showed and the lives they saved is public service at its very best. Yesterday, Axel Rudakubana pled guilty to all charges. He stands responsible for one of the most barbaric crimes in our country's history. The most vile and cowardly attack on little children who could never defend themselves, carried out in the most horrific and traumatic way. The CPS has described him as a young man with a sickening and sustained interest in death and violence, who has shown no sign of remorse. On Thursday before sentencing, the prosecution will set out what happened that day and the nature of those offences. But, Mr. Speaker, now that the conviction has been secured, the families, the people of Southport and the entire country need answers about how this horrendous attack could ever have happened. The government has been constrained in what we could say up to this point about Rudakubana's past to avoid prejudicing any jury trial in line with all the normal rules of our British justice systems, because nothing was more important than securing justice. But now we can start to lay out that background. Multiple different agencies were in contact with Rudakubana and knew about his history of violence. He was referred 3 times to Prevent between December 2019 and April 2021, when aged 13 and 14. Between October 2019 and May 2022, Lancashire Police responded to 5 calls from his home address about his behaviour. He was referred repeatedly to the multi-agency safeguarding hub. He had contact with Children's Social Care, the Early Help Service, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. He was convicted of a violent assault against another child at school and was referred to the Youth Offending Team. He was excluded from one school. He had long periods of absence from another. All those agencies had contact with him. Yet between them, they completely failed to identify the terrible danger that he posed. How did he fall through so many gaps? It is just unbearable to think that something more could and should have been done. So there are grave questions about how this network of agencies failed to identify and act on the risks. There were so many signs of how dangerous he had become, yet the action against him was far too weak. So families need the truth about why the system failed to tackle his violence for so many years. That is why we are setting up an independent public inquiry. Like the Angelini inquiry into Wayne Couzens, it will begin work initially on a non-statutory basis so that it can move quickly into action, but with statutory powers added later as required. We will set out the terms of reference and appoint the chair once we have consulted the coroner and given the families the opportunity to comment. And in addition to examining what went wrong in this horrific case, I am also asking the inquiry to consider the wider challenge of rising youth violence and extremism. Because I have been deeply disturbed at the number of cases involving teenagers drawn into extremism, serious violence and terrorism, including Islamist extremism, far-right extremism, mixed and confused ideology, and the obsession with violence and gore. There has been a threefold increase in under-18s investigated for involvement in terrorism in just 3 years. 162 people were referred to Prevent last year for concerns relating to school massacres. The Met Commissioner has warned about young men who are fixated on violence grazing across extremist and terrorist content online. And Five Eyes counter-terror partners have warned about growing radicalisation of minors, happening as so many of our children and teenagers are being exposed to ever more disturbing materials online, an online ecosystem that is radicalising our children while safety measures are whittled away. The Online Safety Act illegal content codes of practice come into force in March, and the child safety codes should be in place this summer. But companies should take responsibility before then. The prosecution will provide more detail on Thursday about material Rudakubana searched for online, but I can tell the House the government is this week contacting technology companies to ask them to remove dangerous material that he accessed. Companies should not be profiting from hosting content that puts children's lives at risk. And let me set out 4 other areas where we're taking action in advance of the inquiry. Firstly, on Prevent. The Government and Counter-Terrorism Policing jointly commissioned an immediate Prevent learning review during the summer, and I will publish detailed findings following the sentencing. The 3 referrals took place between 3 and 4 years before the Southport attack, including following evidence that he was expressing interest in school shootings, in the London Bridge attack, the IRA, MI5 and the Middle East. On each occasion, Rudakubana's case was assessed by Counter-Terrorism Policing, but in each case, there was no onward referral to specialist channel support. The learning review has concluded the referrals should not have been closed, and that cases such as these, given his age and complex needs, should be referred to channel. It concludes that too much weight was placed on the absence of ideology without considering the vulnerabilities to radicalisation or taking account of whether he was obsessed with massacre or extreme violence. And the cumulative significance of those 3 repeat referrals was not properly considered. Mr. Speaker, the Prevent programme is vital for our national security, and its officers work with huge dedication to keep us safe. But we need it to be effective. Some changes have already been made since 2021, including new Prevent duty guidance, new training for frontline workers on radicalisation, stronger policy on repeat referrals. And in September 2024, a new Prevent assessment framework was launched, supplemented by robust training for all Prevent police officers. But these changes do not go far enough. Given the importance of the programme, I cannot understand how it has been allowed to operate for so long without proper independent oversight. That is why I announced before Christmas the introduction of a new independent Prevent Commissioner with the power to review cases and to ensure that standards are being met. So I'm today appointing Lord David Anderson, KC, as an interim Prevent Commissioner to start work immediately, and his first task will be to conduct a thorough review of the Prevent history in this case to identify what changes are needed to make sure serious cases are not missed, particularly where there is mixed and unclear ideology. I've also tasked my department to conduct an end-to-end review of Prevent thresholds, including on Islamist extremism, where referrals have previously been too low. And we're looking at cases where mental ill health or neurodivergence is a factor and developing new arrangements with other agencies which may not meet the threshold for channel counter-extremism support, but where violent behaviour urgently must be addressed. Second, 2 shocking facts around knife crime emerged from this case. The Prevent Learning Review found that Rudakubana admitted to having carried a knife more than 10 times, yet the action against him was far too weak. And despite the fact that he'd been convicted for violence and was just 17, he was easily able to order a knife on Amazon. That's a total disgrace, and it must change. So we will bring in stronger measures to tackle knife sales online in the Crime and Policing Bill this spring. Mr. Speaker, thirdly, as the Prime Minister has set out this morning, we need to ensure our laws keep up with the changing violent and extremist threats we face. It is for the police and CPS to decide whether individual cases meet the definition set out in the Terrorism Act 2000 when making charges. But given the growing number of cases where perpetrators are seeking to terrorise, even without a clear ideology, we need to ensure the law, powers and sentencing are strong enough to cope. I have therefore asked the independent reviewer on terrorism powers to examine the legislation in this area in the light of the modern threats we face. Finally, Mr. Speaker, let me address the issues of contempt of court. Because the British way of justice means information is presented to the court by the police and CPS with restrictions on what can be said beforehand, so the jury does not get partial or prejudicial information in advance to make sure that the trial is fair and justice is done. Social media puts those long-established rules under strain, especially where partial and inaccurate information appears online, and the Law Commission is reviewing the contempt of court rules in that light. But let me be clear, where the police, government and journalists are given clear advice from the CPS about contempt of court and about not publishing information in advance of a trial, if we did not respect that, and a killer walked free, we would never be forgiven. Mr. Speaker, there are times when something so unfathomably terrible happens that whatever words we find feel grossly insufficient. And that is how it feels over the Southport attack. So let there be no doubt. Responsibility for this outrage lies squarely with the perpetrator, but equally, in the wake of such a monstrous atrocity, we have to ask every question, no matter how difficult, and where change is needed, we must act. That is now our task. We owe that to the victims, to their loved ones, and we owe it to the country, because protecting the public is the first duty of the government and the shared purpose of this House. I commend this statement to the House.
Right, let us start and we'll get everybody in who was there on time. Can I come now to the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Phil?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement and for the briefing which she very kindly arranged. Firstly, let us remember the 3 young, innocent victims of this savage and senseless attack. B.B. King was just 6 years old, Elsie Dot Stankham was 7, and Alice Da Silva Aguiar 9 years old. Their lives were cruelly cut short as they attended a Taylor Swift dance class. It should have been a time of joy, part of a precious and innocent childhood, to be cherished and remembered. And yet, the darkest of shadows fell over Southport that day as these girls were robbed of their young lives. Let us not forget that 8 more children and 2 adults were seriously injured on that day as well. Many of us in this House are parents or grandparents, and many people listening will be as well. We can only begin to imagine the pain and grief the parents and family of baby Elsie and Alice must now be feeling. And of course, we should recognise and thank the first responders who arrived on the scene. So, Mr. Speaker, we owe it to the memory of those children and to their bereaved parents to learn the lessons from this terrible incident and to take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so, in that spirit, I welcome and support the inquiry announced yesterday. I asked the Home Secretary to confirm that it will be placed on a statutory footing as soon as possible to ensure its independence and also to enable it to compel disclosure of the evidence which it may need. It is vital to get to the truth about what opportunities may have existed to stop the evil perpetrator, Rudakubana, from committing these sickening murders. Rudakubana was encountered multiple times, as the Home Secretary said, by the police, social services, the school system and the Prevent programme over a period of several years. The inquiry will find out, I hope, whether mistakes were made or whether the law needs to change. And the Home Secretary mentioned some areas that will rightly be looked at, and I support that. I hope the Home Secretary can also confirm this will include consideration of whether the Mental Health Act was adequate for this case. The Home Secretary has also rightly referred to Prevent. A review of Prevent was conducted by William Shawcross, and the last government responded in February 2024. Will the Home Secretary now commit to implementing all of the recommendations of the Shawcross review? Let me now turn to what happened after the murders and to the importance of openness and transparency. Firstly, and this is a very serious and important question, will the Home Secretary confirm that the inquiry will also cover the government, police and CPS response to the murders, and especially the handling of public communications and the appalling riots that followed? It's a very important question. I would be grateful if the Home Secretary would directly answer that in her response. Now, the Prime Minister this morning acknowledged that he knew about the background to the case and to Rudakubana himself, including the fact that he had been referred to Prevent on 3 separate occasions, and that Rudakubana had been found to be in possession of ricin, a highly toxic chemical, and a manual detailing al-Qaeda terrorist methods, itself an offence under the Terrorism Act. The Prime Minister also said this morning that he did not disclose any of this to the public in the days and weeks after the murders for fear of prejudicing the subsequent murder trial. And it is, of course, important for journalists and for politicians, and indeed this House, to do nothing that might prejudice a trial. But David Hall, KC, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, said this on the Today programme in the context of this case in October, and it bears quoting in full. Jonathan Hall said this: "The government has to be aware that if there is an information gap, then other voices, particularly on social media, will fill that gap." He went on, "If there is any information you can give, put it in the public domain, and be really careful you don't fall into the trap of saying, we can say zilch because there are criminal proceedings. Quite often," he said, "there is a fair amount that can be put into the public domain." Jonathan Hall concluded by saying, "The police now realise that just saying there is a charge, we can't say any more, is not going to cut it these days." So the independent reviewer is saying that the government and police can put some material into the public domain without prejudicing subsequent trials. And in fact, on October the 29th, Rudakubana was charged with possessing the ricin and the terror manual. That was then made public. So if it can be made public in October without risking prejudice of the murder trial, it follows that it could have been made public in August without prejudicing that same trial. Background facts on other cases over the years have been made public after arrest and before trial without prejudice, and the shields relating to 2 of those cases are in this chamber. So why did the Prime Minister not make public some of this background information in August when he knew it, when later disclosure of that information in October demonstrated such disclosure could be made without prejudice? And why did the Deputy Prime Minister on July the 31st dismiss as, and I quote, "fake news" those saying there may be further facts to come out? Let me just briefly, Mr. Speaker, before concluding, explain why this is important. As Jonathan Hall said, if there is a void, then misinformation, especially online, can fill that void. And this appears to be what happened here. And some of that information, it is said, originated overseas from hostile states. It is possible, indeed it is even likely, that this misinformation that was put into the void fuelled the totally unacceptable riots we then subsequently saw. So, will the Home Secretary accept, given what I've just said and what Jonathan Hall said, does she accept there should and could have been more openness and transparency, as I just set out, without prejudicing the trial, and that disclosing more of that truth openly and transparently would have helped combat the damaging misinformation that circulated and which arguably fuelled the riots? Will she confirm the inquiry will look at that aspect of events? Mr. Speaker, this was an appalling tragedy. Young girls murdered with their whole lives ahead of them. Let us all learn the lessons from this tragedy in honour of their memory.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Shadow Home Secretary raised a series of points, which is obviously a substantial shift in position for him and his party from the position they've taken in government. He asked about whether the status of the inquiry. I can confirm it's going to start quickly on a non-statutory basis in the same way that the Angelini inquiry did, but I can confirm it will be given whatever powers it needs, including on a statutory basis, so that it can get any information that it needs. He referred to the Shawcross review. I can confirm that the government has implemented 33 out of the 34 recommendations, but I would just gently point out to him that actually the approach that the Shawcross review took was to say that the PREVENT programme should be narrowed and should actually just focus particularly on the cases around terrorism, and in fact could have put at risk, actually including less cases like this where ideology is less clear. He then raises the issue about the information that was provided, and he will know that the Contempt of Court Act was set out in 1981. The Jonathan Hall has indeed highlighted the problem of disinformation online, social media actors who are not bound by the same rules that the police, the media and the government follow. And he refers, for example, to the name and the nationality being provided, which in practice they were in this case, after misinformation appeared online. But ultimately, he has also said all of this is governed by the Contempt of Court Act 1981, and the Law Commission is reviewing that. But it is not for the government to ignore the law or the advice that we are given when justice for families is at stake. And let me point out to him that the previous Conservative government did not publish information before the trial about the PREVENT referral for the perpetrator who killed Sir David Amis. None of us criticised them for that because none of us wanted to put at risk justice for Sir David's family, nor did they publish information before the trial on the PREVENT referral of the asylum seeker who killed Tom Roberts. In fact, they didn't even publish that after the trial. It only came out in the inquest. And the minister, who even after the trial refused to answer my questions on whether they knew that he was wanted for murdering 2 people in Serbia when he was allowed to enter the country, was the current Shadow Justice Secretary. Now, we have been keen to publish the information on PREVENT referrals from the start, but throughout, the advice to us has been clear. And if we had ignored the advice that we were given from about the case that put towards us and about the information that the police and the CPS were working through in order to get justice, and if as a result a killer had walked free, no one would ever have forgiven the government or anyone else. The most important thing is to get justice, and then once justice is secured, to make sure at this point the questions are answered about what went wrong and why 3 young girls' lives were lost. That is the question he should be focusing on right now.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been another tough week for my Southport constituency. I'm sure members across the House will appreciate. I'd like to start by thanking the Home Secretary and also the Prime Minister for the calm, diligent way in which they've undertook their work over the last 6 months, and for the way in which they've been good friends to Southport. I was clear back in the summer that I did not want people speculating online as to the motives or the background of the person that we can now say was the murderer of those 3 girls. We were risking the trial would be prejudiced. The trial could have collapsed because of that speculation, because of what wasn't just speculation, but also in some respects downright lies. And downright lies that were being circulated in the interests of gaining political gain for themselves, with the interests of justice a distant second. So in the same vein, will the Home Secretary agree with me that the next stage of achieving justice for my community and the families impacted so desperately by the crime back in July, the public inquiry, should also be allowed to undertake its work and make its recommendations free of the ridiculous nonsense and lies that we've seen from public figures who should know better, circulating purely for their own interests?
Secretary.
My honourable friend has been a really important voice for his community throughout this unimaginably difficult time and has spoken for them with great dignity and passion, including in this House. He is right that nothing should be done. It is part of our British justice traditions that information is produced at the trial, but not in advance for fear of prejudicing a jury and then for undermining justice and potentially letting criminals walk free. And he is right that we should never do that. But he is also right that his community, the people across Southport, particularly the families involved, need now to get answers. And the answers that they need about how on earth this shocking and disturbing barbaric attack could have been able to happen. What went wrong? What could have been done to prevent it? But also how we as a society face up to the rising youth violence and extremism that we have seen, this being just one example of some very disturbing cases. That is the justice and the answers those families need.
Come to Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. What happened in Southport last year was a horrific tragedy. 3 innocent young girls, Alice, Bibi and Elsie, lost their lives to an act of senseless, brutal violence, and our thoughts go out to the bereaved families and their friends for whom this week will be incredibly difficult. We all owe it to these girls to ensure that a senseless tragedy like this can never happen again. It has been deeply concerning to hear reports about how, in the lead-up to the attack, warning signs were missed as the attacker fell through the cracks of the system. So the Liberal Democrats welcome the government's commitment to an inquiry, and there are clearly tough questions that need to be asked. The inquiry must not shy away from getting those answers. Of course, this inquiry, like others, will only reach its full potential when there is a duty of candour that requires public officials and authorities to cooperate fully. And so I'd welcome more details from the Home Secretary on when her government plans to finally introduce the Hillsborough Law to Parliament. Our country also deserves a counter-terrorism strategy that keeps our communities safe and is fit to tackle the modern challenges we face in an increasingly complex online world crossing international boundaries. So will the Home Secretary confirm that these concerns will be addressed in the upcoming counter-terrorism strategy? This must be a watershed moment where we move forwards by building a system that avoids future failures like we've seen in this case. And it is my sincere hope that we can work together across this House to make this a reality.
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member makes an important point. The duty of candour is something that we want to introduce as part of the Hillsborough Law. She's also right to talk about the challenges in terms of countering terrorism, countering extremism, and also these changing patterns we've seen of extreme violence, the kind of thing that the Met Commissioner has described, where those with a fixation on violence and gore are also consuming different bits of terrorist material and extremist material as well. The ideology may be unclear, but they pose a danger to the public. And what this inquiry needs to look at is all of those issues, but we also need, as part of the prevent work we are doing and the countering terrorism work we are doing, to make pace in these areas as well.
Lawrence Eshelove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Home Secretary for her statement this afternoon. And as many right honourable members have said, our thoughts remain with Bibi, Elsie and Alice. And we can all remember where we were that late mid-morning on the 29th of July. I just dropped my 2 children at their holiday camp at school. And when the news broke, that panic, and when you almost stop for a minute to think, are my children safe? And we think about the other children and the trauma that they will be feeling. and the first responders who ran towards that danger, knowing that they could have been harmed. And the Home Secretary has announced an inquiry, but we've seen that sadly the issues of young children as young as 16, 15, what they are viewing online, and the nature of the violence that was used on Eliane Andon when she was tragically stabbed in Croydon on the 27th of September. The nature of the violence that Alex Rudakubana used on these 3 girls. How would the Secretary of State the Home Secretary ensure that the institutions which, if we're honest, have failed to see those warning signs will not fail in the future? What would the inquiry do differently so that we are not finding ourselves as a House coming back to recount dangerous tragedies again in the future?
My honourable friend is right to describe how every parent, every grandparent will have felt on hearing those awful descriptions that on that day in July, and also right to focus on what it is our young people, our children, are seeing online. And if we don't face up to this, the damage that we could be doing through generations is really disturbing and troubling. But that means that social media companies need to take responsibility. The Online Safety Act will bring stronger codes and requirements in, but they also need to take some responsibility instead of going backwards, which they are at the moment.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Home Secretary's statement, and my thoughts are with everybody involved. The list that she set out of the points of the agencies and institutions that could have intervened sooner is truly terrifying. So what reassurance can she give the House that this is a cross-government piece of work and that all agencies and institutions will be involved? And as and when the inquiry makes recommendations, which it will do hopefully on an interim basis, will she give some commitment that she will look carefully at them and implement them as soon as possible?
Home Secretary.
We'll certainly, of course, look at any recommendations that come from this inquiry because it is so important. We need it to look both at what went wrong in this case, and it's particularly about the interactions between different agencies. There were so many agencies involved, but as a network, they just failed both to identify the risk and to have sufficient action in place. Lancashire County Council have done a initial rapid review, and there has to be a statutory child safeguarding practice review, and of course there also has to be a coroner's inquiry as well. However, our view is exactly that. These are not sufficient because of that cross-agency examination you need to do about all of the things that have gone wrong in this case. We have to start from the dangers that were posed in Southport to those children in such a devastating way, and then see why did the system so badly fail to protect children against those dangers, rather than just every organisation working in its own silo and only doing their bit and then leaving children at risk.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for her statement and for announcing the setting up of the public inquiry. I want to remember Alice, BB and Elsie, their families and friends. I also want to remember the other victims of the attack and the first responders, some of whom have told me over the last 6 months their harrowing accounts of what they found at the Hearts base in Southport. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we in this House should recommit to the principle nothing we say or do in this place or elsewhere could prejudice criminal proceedings or prevent justice being secured? Does she agree that to have done so in this case would have been an insult to the memories of Alice, BB and Elsie, an insult to their families and friends, and an insult to everyone in the community in Southport who were and remain so badly affected by what happened on the 29th of July last year?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend makes a really important point, because the families and all the people of Southport, the people across the country, need truth, need answers about what happened and about what went so badly wrong in this case. And that is why the information is put before the trial. That is why the information is released after the trial. That is how the British justice system works. But crucially, at the heart of this, they have to have justice. There has to be an account for such a terrible, terrible, barbaric crime. And we, all of us, have to make sure that that justice is delivered, and rightly, because when lives have been lost in such a terrible way, justice is the minimum they deserve.
Sir David Davis.
I hope the Home Secretary will not take it as a discourtesy if I say to her that actually it should be the Prime Minister making this statement here today. I say that because this morning he said on television that singleton terrorist attacks were a very new occurrence. They're not. They've been going on for nearly a decade, many in London, one in the yard of this House of Commons, and of course one killed Sir David Amess, our colleague. And in that attack on Sir David Amess, the police declared it a terrorist incident the same day, without 3 prevent references, without ricin, without an al-Qaeda manual. They declared it a terrorist event the same day. So we all wonder why this was not the case here, when there was such evidence. This is a clear mistake, is it not?
Home Secretary.
So the decision about the application of the Terrorism Act 2000 is one for the police and ultimately the CPS when they lay charges based on the operational information that they have. The prosecution will lay out more information that they put before sentencing that they would have put before the court on Tuesday had the information today. So we'd had the offender not pleaded guilty initially, and that is for them to decide. But the point the Prime Minister made this morning was that this was clearly a case where someone attempted to terrorise the community. That was clearly his intention, to kill those children and also to terrorise more widely. And that is why we have to ensure that even where there are cases where the police or the prosecution say they have not been able to prove ideology, that we still have the right powers, the right sentencing, the right ability to respond with swiftness and seriousness to the kinds of cases we face. And that is why he has said that this needs to be reviewed. I referred to the independent reviewer of terrorism, powers looking at these issues. And it's also why we have this statement to the House and are making this inquiry, because where I would disagree with him when he said, well, we've had these cases for a long time, the thing we've seen in very recent years is this really big increase in youth violence and extremism on a really disturbing scale. And I do think that needs to be part of the inquiry as well.
Sean Davis.
Can I associate myself and my community with a statement from the Home Secretary on this tragic incident? Whether it be purchasing knives online or whether it be the sharing of these horrible videos celebrating violence and death, there's clearly a gap between the ability of the state to hold social media companies to account and also online retailers. What more can the government do, together with the intelligence services, to take robust action and hold to account these companies that are allowing this extremism, this violence, this horror to be present on their social media companies?
Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend raises a really important point. We are raising with the companies some of the particular dangerous material that this terrible offender accessed online, and the police and prosecution will say more about some of that material later this week. But he's also right to highlight the issue around online knife sales, because we know from the case of Ronan Kanda, who was so brutally murdered by a ninja sword, where the perpetrator was able to get that, just buy it online, just pick it up with no age checks at all. And in this case, for a 17-year-old to be able to just get the knife that he was able to use online from Amazon, that is just frankly shocking. Commander Stephen Clayman has been doing a review for us on online knife sales and on the kinds of checks that should be taking place. And we will, based on that review, be bringing forward new measures to tackle this problem.
James Cleverly.
I'm particularly drawn to the line in the immediate learning review that it concludes that too much weight was placed on the absence of ideology without considering the vulnerabilities to radicalisation. I mean, the fact is, much of the challenge over the summer is because there was an understandable lack of public understanding of the distinction between a terrorist incident and a non-terrorist incident. Had this person done exactly the same thing but was driven by a desire to create a caliphate here in the UK, this would of course be defined as a terrorist attack. The fact it didn't is of no solace to those families who have lost loved ones. Is it now not the time? And I appreciate this could be part of the review, but I would urge her to make sure this is a particular emphasis of the review, to get rid of this entirely arbitrary distinction with motivation and focus exclusively on the risk and the actions.
Home Secretary.
Well, I think the right honourable member, the former Home Secretary, makes an extremely important point here, because from the point of view of families, from the point of view of the community, this was an attack that was intended to terrorise the community, and also from the point of view of families, the real concern is about the scale of harm that they've seen, the loss of children's lives and the impact on that community as well. The law is set out in the Terrorism Act 2000, and there is also a serious consideration for different agencies about the nature of the response. So if you have an ideological attack or a motivation, then it may be that the kind of countering extremism response, the kind of support that the Channel programme provides, might be targeted in one particular way if it is around an extremist ideology that needs to be challenged and tackled and taken down, or alternatively, if the issue is around mental health or the issue is around obsession with violence and gore, those may need different kinds of response. But he is right that the threats, from the point of view of the community, will feel the same. That's why the law needs to be looked at again, but it's also why we need to have this inquiry that can look at where the gaps are in the way in which different state agencies respond, because we've seen those growing gaps, and we've seen, obviously, those gaps in the most traumatic of ways in this case.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the statement the Home Secretary has made today? And in her statement and in the Prime Minister's speech this morning, they have painted a terrifying picture of how terrorism is changing in this country and the threat that we face is evolving, especially with the proliferation of extremely violent online content, and which is having an effect on mixed ideologies and from ideologies across the spectrum. Clearly, part of the response to this is going to be the response of the intelligence services. So can the Home Secretary tell us about how the intelligence services will be responding to this evolving threat and what the government is doing to prevent this growth of extremism through extreme online content?
Home Secretary.
Well, he's right that what we seem to have is cases where there is extreme violence or obsession grows around extreme violence, and then you have young people who then may cast around to maybe consuming different kinds of terrorist material or extremist material, but at its heart may be an obsession with violence as well. So different circumstances then require different kinds of response, but actually the scale of the growing obsession with violence should be a serious concern to us, because you do think, what are we allowing to happen to our kids and to our teenagers if we've seen this kind of obsession grow? And that's why we need action. Clearly, the focus of the intelligence and security agencies is around those cases where particularly there is organised ideology and radicalisation, as well as state threats. But we have to deal with the kinds of threats that our society faces much more widely, and that means everyone needs to be part of it.
Can I associate myself with the remarks of colleagues about the murder of these 3 wee girls, the bravery of the first responders, but most of all we think about the families of those left behind? Can I also agree that the way in which we talk about these kind of cases, we have a responsibility to the victims to make sure we do so responsibly while keeping the government under scrutiny? There is a fast evolving situation in terms of technology companies. Can the Home Secretary tell us what areas she's looking at in terms of enforcement? But can she also tell me that it's a multi-agency, very diverse case? What interaction is she having with the Scottish Government and the devolved administrations in the areas where they have responsibility? Thank you.
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member is right that there are issues around the the responsibility of social media companies, and the stronger powers will obviously be brought in as part of the Online Safety Act, but we are urging the companies to take responsibility now and not to continue to profit from really dangerous material that is putting kids at risk. In terms of the discussions with the Scottish Government, we actually have broad discussions planned for later this week around some of our shared Home Office responsibilities, and he will know, obviously, policing issues and crime issues are devolved, but national security issues where terrorism cases may fall or have an impact are also reserved matters as well. And so on these kinds of cases, we would expect to obviously consult and to discuss with the Scottish Government what the way forward is.
Paul Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for her statement, and my thoughts and prayers are with everyone involved. Acts of terror devastate the family of victims who are left to pick up the pieces, having their closest loved ones robbed of them in the cruellest way. As with the Forbury Gardens terrorist attack in 2020, which saw my constituents, Gary and Jan Fairlong, lose their beloved son James, these acts often take place after multiple agency failings. The Forbury Gardens perpetrator had been referred to Prevent 4 times and was known to mental health services. It will be important to those families in Southport that lessons are learned and acted upon in a timely way. So will the government engage with me and Survivors Against Terror over their calls for a survivors' charter which would expand rights to survivors and the families of victims?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and the Security Minister has met with and had regular discussions with the survivors of terror, because the concerns they raise are very serious about the way in which survivors, for example, of the Manchester Arena attack ended up feeling badly let down, and the additional support that can be needed in these cases. So we will continue to discuss with those organisations about the support that's needed.
Sir Julian.
I trust that the Home Secretary agrees with me that the courage shown by the dance teacher and the member of the public who intervened should appropriately be recognised. But what troubles me is that we seem to have a subtext here of saying that if only this particular ticking time bomb had been successfully referred to Prevent, that could have stopped him doing what he did. Will the Home Secretary share with the House what measures are in place, assuming that someone so committed to fanaticism would not respond to Prevent? What measures are in place to keep the terrible events from happening? Do TPIMs, for example, apply in a case like that?
Home Secretary.
I think the honourable member makes a really important point here, because those referrals as well were 3 to 4 years before the attack, and multiple different agencies had contact with him. But there is a huge question about what powers, what interventions are available in a case where, even had they sufficiently identified the scale of risk and dangers he poses, what could be done? That is one of the reasons why the government is determined to bring in a new power, a youth diversion order, to be able to address some of the really difficult cases, particularly around teenagers, to look at what requirements might be put on young people in these cases, and we will bring forward legislation as part of the Crime and Policing Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The barbaric murder of those 3 little girls in Southport is part of a growing problem of youngsters fixated on violence and gore, as the Home Secretary has said. Though this worrying phenomenon has been fuelled by the rapid growth of websites and social media forums which promote and revel in that violence. So can the Home Secretary confirm that the inquiry into Southport will look into exactly this danger promoted by those websites?
Home Secretary.
We will certainly make sure that this issue is clearly in the scope of the inquiry. We need the inquiry to look at why we have so many more young people getting drawn into obsession with violence, extremist activity, and what exactly is going wrong and why, so that we can make sure that across society we take the action that is needed to keep our children safe.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary has told us that last year alone 162 people have been referred to Prevent over concerns relating to school massacres. a truly shocking and disturbing figure. So could the Home Secretary please tell us how many of these people are currently in detention?
Home Secretary.
Well, he will know that the referral to prevent can be for young people who may have expressed an interest in school massacre, as opposed to those who have yet committed a crime. But the point of the Prevent programme is to try and get early intervention to take action to prevent young people committing crime. My view is that the powers are currently not strong enough to prevent young people committing crimes or getting drawn into this extremist violence, and that is exactly why we need to introduce the youth diversion order. That is a stronger power for the police to be able to take action in these extremely serious cases.
Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important to note that this attacker is a terrorist. He's been charged under the Terrorism Act and the Biological Weapons Act. The man is a terrorist, Mr. Speaker. The attack itself has not been labelled as terrorism due to the lack of a clear ideological motive, a decision for the police and the CPS. Will the Home Office look into how our legal frameworks can be updated to recognise the full horror of acts intended to terrorise?
Home Secretary.
My honourable friend is right. We do need to ensure that the legal framework is up to date to make sure that there is the scope and the powers and the sentencing, frankly, as well, to ensure that where there are acts intended to terrorise, even where there is no ideology, that there are sufficient powers in place to be able to deal with this. And he is also right to say that because this man has been charged under the Terrorism Act and has pleaded guilty to a terrorist offence, I can confirm he will be treated as a terrorist offender in prison as well.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Madam Deputy Speaker, if the authorities remain silent, then bad people will write the script. On the 16th of October 2021, those authorities and then their political masters were frank about what had happened the previous day in Southend, and there were no riots. Why is that different to this?
Home Secretary.
Well, I would say to the honourable member, in the case that he refers to, the attack on Sir David Amis, who I regard as a friend, and I know he does as well, was a great loss to this House, the government did not publish crucial information, for example, around the Prevent referral that had taken place. There was a lot of information that was not provided until the trial, and in fact this government is going further in providing information after the trial than was provided in that case as well. And I also don't think that anyone should attempt to excuse people who threw bricks and rocks at police officers as being somehow something to do with what information that they were provided and when. They committed crimes, they need to take responsibility for those crimes as well.
Gregor Poynton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard from Merseyside Police, the CPS and Counter-Terrorism Police about the wide range of violent content that the accused was accessing. That included genocide and also social media searches for violent, fatal stabbings. Now, I know the Home Secretary has covered some of this in her statement and previous questions, but can I ask her what more should the social media and search engine giants be doing? Firstly, to stopping our young people accessing this content in the first place, and secondly, once they're being made aware of it, taking it down quickly from their sites.
So I think that my friend makes a really important point, because the thing about the social media companies is they have incredibly sophisticated technology and resources. These are the social media companies that know exactly how to target every single one of us on things that we might be interested online, and to use their algorithms in all kinds of sophisticated ways. They have the capability to do far more to identify this dangerous content and to take action on it. And I do believe that they should use those responsibilities rather than rowing back from content moderation, rather than reducing the responsible action that they need to take.
Saoirse Eastwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for your statement today, and indeed constituents across Lagan Valley are sending their thoughts and prayers to not just the families of Elsie, Alice and Baby, but indeed the community of Southport. Something that has deeply concerned me for a long time is indeed this radicalisation, particularly of young people, and you have explicitly stated that in your statement today, that it is an online surge of young people becoming radicalised, also including young people that are interested and looking at particular violent content against women and other sorts of terror linked. I would want to understand how the Home Secretary sees the lack of an ideology being captured in a way that it means that we can actually identify these potential perpetrators, and also in terms of actually the laws that we can make in this House to stop social media companies not only profiting but actually being aware of this violent and terrorist content that is online.
The honourable member is right to raise this. The Director of NI5 has talked about how the security services are seeing far too many cases with very young people being drawn into poisonous online extremism, and 13% of all of those investigated for involvement in UK terrorism now under 18. That is a disturbing fact for all of us. And she's right too that this needs to look at the complexity of, there are some young people who become radicalised around an ideology early on. There are others who become obsessed with violence. There are others who may switch between different extreme ideas and perspectives. But the point is that all of them are at risk of becoming dangerous to communities if they get drawn down this extremist track and their ideas get poisoned in this way by things that they see online. That is why it's so important, and that's why it's a central part of the inquiry.
Josh Simons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for updating the House and welcome the uncompromising inquiry that she and the Prime Minister have announced. I'd also like to ask about social media and the digital information environment. I used to work in a technology company for a long period of time, and I totally concur with the Home Secretary's comments. They know what's circulating online. They know what's getting virality. So I'd like to ask the Home Secretary whether, after the summer, she feels that she and the Prime Minister have the information that they need in order to make decisions in real time to secure our information online environment.
Home Secretary.
So, the honourable member makes an important point. I don't think that anyone would suggest that in the end, ministers are in a position to make decisions on individual cases. What we need is the right kind of framework in place. Clearly, the Online Safety Act will put new structures and systems in place. The Prime Minister has made clear this morning that we should not shy away from taking any further action that is needed in order to address this, because fundamentally, if this is impacting on the safety of our children, we do need to act.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister's denial in August that Rudakubana was being investigated for offences under the Terrorism Act didn't protect the trial, because we found out these facts anyway when Rudakubana was charged in October. And the same disclosure didn't cause other trials, such as that of the Parsons Green tube bomber, to fail before. I'm not talking about the details of prevent referrals, which the Home Secretary has used in answers to similar questions, but of the information that was disclosed in October. If a jury knew that before the trial, why couldn't the Prime Minister have told the country the truth in August?
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member will know that the investigation is carried out by the police. The Crown Prosecution Service decide what charges to lay, and also decide, based on the evidence that they have gathered, how and when those charges should be laid. That is the British justice system that we have. It is the decisions made by police, it's decisions made by the prosecutors. They are rightly independent of ministers, and to be honest, I strongly believe, as part of our British judicial tradition, that independence must continue.
Conor Naismith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. From everything we have heard so far, the murderer in Southport was someone with a history of violence and a fascination with violence, and someone who was just 17 years old. at the time of this horrific attack. There are no circumstances in which he should have been able to buy a knife himself. So will the Home Secretary agree with me that we have to get to the bottom of how that deadly weapon was able to end up in his hands and ensure that teenagers are unable to buy these kinds of weapons in the future?
Home Secretary.
Honourable friend is right. Here, the perpetrator should never have been able to buy a knife online, and it is really disturbing that it is still far too easy, despite all of the cases that we've seen in the past, it is still far too easy for young people to be able to get access to knives online. That is why we will take action as part of the crime policing bill, including taking action on online executives so that they take responsibility for the kinds of checks that need to take place.
Shockout Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for her statement. 3 referrals to prevent, 5 referrals to the local police force, multiple referrals to multiple hubs. Yet we still didn't protect Elsie, Alice and Bibi. We have failed them. We must ensure this never happens again. Would the Minister agree that whoever is the perpetrator, the victims are always terrorised? And does she agree that obsession with ideology may have been an underlying factor why we missed this perpetrator, and we need to relook at the Shawcross recommendations of ideology obsession?
Secretary.
Well, he's right that the Prevent Learning Review did identify that in this particular case, the focus on ideology may have meant that some of the vulnerabilities to radicalisation were missed. We also have to recognise that depending on the individual case, where there is ideology, that is different from cases where there is not and may require different kind of response. So the assessment of risk, the assessment of the danger a young person poses may need to be the same, but the kind of response that the action that the state needs to take, depending on what is driving that action and that danger and that risk, needs to change. But for too long, some of those mixed ideology cases, some of those unclear cases may have been being missed because we haven't had sufficient focus on them. That's what the inquiry needs to do.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for her statement today. And of course the victims and all those affected are very much in our thoughts and prayers. And I think it's important that nothing that we say detracts from the sole responsibility of the perpetrator for these awful crimes. But it's right that we look into the situations beforehand. And I note that the Home Secretary has mentioned a few times multiple agency involvement and warnings. And I think for me that's one of the most concerning and shocking things. How come so many agencies were aware and raised concerns? This wasn't a lone wolf that popped out of nowhere. Who does she think ultimately bears responsibility for managing this perpetrator's risk?
Home Secretary.
The honourable member's question gets to the heart of the problem. So he's right that the responsibility for this appalling and barbaric attack lies with the attacker himself. He needs to face the consequences. It is the most heinous crime that he has committed. But we also have to ask those questions on behalf of the families about why so many agencies, there should have been a network of responsible agencies, in the end together failed to identify the scale of risk and to take the scale of action that was needed in this case. That is what the inquiry needs to look at, and I think part of the challenge is that it can be too easy for each agency to think that somebody else is addressing this bit of the problem, when actually there needs to be a much stronger approach between agencies. That's what the inquiry must look at.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think the vast majority of the British people agree with the government's own independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, who said repeatedly that in these serious incidents, these horrific crimes, more information needs to be put out sooner to avoid an information vacuum. But that's in conflict, of course, with the need to prevent prejudicing a fair trial. And therefore, does the Home Secretary agree with me that it's incumbent upon us in this House to find a way to overcome and reduce that conflict so we get more information sooner?
Home Secretary.
Well, the honourable member raises the issue about, particularly in a world of social media where there can be all sorts of information online and therefore there could be different kinds of information available, and yet, as he rightly says, we have to make sure that justice is done. We have to make sure that a jury is not prejudiced by information so that a killer can walk free, but we also have to make sure that people can get answers, people can get the crucial information that they need. The Law Commission is reviewing the Contempt of Court Act. That dates back to 1981, but I know he would recognise the importance of us following the law in the meantime and recognising the way we need to make sure that justice is done. And now that we have a verdict, making sure that the families can get proper answers, can find out what went wrong in this case, get the answers that they so badly need and deserve.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Well done, Home Secretary, on the proposals you're bringing forward. You have my full support in turning over every stone to look into the cases, and I fully, wholeheartedly agree with all the powers you're bringing forward. However, that is half of the story. The Home Secretary rightly talks about the balancing of possibly a criminal maybe walking free, but the actual nature of having riots up and down this country that happened. So will she consider conducting a review on creating a framework about how government talks about these issues so that it's standardised with the media, so that there's no political point scoring across this chamber? Because at the heart of this issue is how the public perceive information was held from them. And if we can stop that, we can do a review into the rioting to make sure there are no further riots, because there weren't riots in October when this information came out. So there's a discrepancy there that needs looking at, and I'd be grateful if she'd take that up.
Home Secretary.
Well, I would sort of point out to him that the violent disorders stopped when people realised they would face consequences for it, and when there was a clear police and criminal justice system response, because there is no excuse for throwing rocks and bricks at the police. There is no excuse for throwing rocks and bricks at the very same police officers who had to deal with the most horrendous attack on those little children in Southport in the first place. And I think it's really important that this inquiry and this focus now needs to be on getting those children the answers, getting the answers for the families, for those children, the answers that they need about what went wrong in this terrible case, and not trying to somehow excuse a bunch of thugs who were throwing rocks and bricks at the police, for whom, frankly, there is no excuse at all.
Jim Allister.
As we reflect on the horror of the murder of these three young girls, we all and the public have many questions. Will the terms of reference of the inquiry permit an answer to this question? How far did the inaction by the various agencies, how far was it influenced by fear of disturbing racial or community relations? Was that a factor in the inaction? And in terms of the inaction, we heard there were 3 ineffective referrals in this case to prevent. We've also heard of 162 other referrals to prevent. Have those referrals since been reviewed as to the adequacy of how they were dealt with?
Home Secretary.
Well, specifically on that point, the reason I have introduced the new Prevent Commissioner, and Sir David Anderson, Lord David Anderson, is now beginning that work as the Interim Commissioner starting right now, is because there is currently no independent review of Prevent decisions, of Prevent processes. Now, I think that's a problem because the decisions that Prevent takes are incredibly important. They need to be effective. We need to make sure that standards are maintained, and that's why we need to make sure there's an independent review. We have independent inspectors in other aspects, for example, of policing or other aspects of the work that public services do, but we need the independent commissioner to be brought in. So that allows him to be able to review not just this case, but also similar cases as well. And in terms of the scope of the inquiry, the Prime Minister has already made clear this morning, this inquiry will follow the evidence wheresoever it takes the inquiry, and no stone must go unturned.
Ben Obsi-Jecti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On what dates were the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary made aware that Axel Rudakubana was in possession of ricin and an al-Qaeda training manual? And will the inquiry cover public communications after the murders?
Secretary.
Well, ministers were, of course, updated throughout, and the Home Office was advised about ricin in August, and we were advised about the document much later on in October, and we made sure that the official opposition were also briefed. But in the end, those decisions and investigations are matters for the police on an operational basis. That is the tradition that we have in this country, where we have operational independence for policing, and why we also have the operationally independent decisions made by the CPS. And I actually think it is really sad that so many members opposite have chosen to simply ask questions about the timing of information when they know that this is governed by the Contempt of Court Act, and when they know this is about providing justice for families who lost their loved ones, rather than asking the serious questions about why that terrible and horrific and barbaric act took place. And I would really just ask him and other members who've decided which issues they want to focus on, they need to consider very seriously what they think is the most important issue here when so many lives were lost.
Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In her statement, the Home Secretary says, "Let there be no doubt, responsibility for this outrage lies squarely with the perpetrator." That's indubitably true, but I would argue there's blood on the hands of this myriad of very difficult to understand government agencies and quangos who charge around in ever-decreasing circles and blame everybody else when something goes wrong. So on that basis, will the Home Secretary commit to reviewing every single dropped or downgraded case where Prevent failed to act appropriately in order to avoid another heartbreaking catastrophe like this one?
Well, there are two things that are important that we have announced today. The first is the inquiry itself, which needs to go to the heart of what went wrong in this case, why so many agencies knew about this incredibly dangerous perpetrator who committed this barbaric act, but also to establish the new Prevent Independent Commissioner who can review cases, who can look at the different cases and the approach that's being taken to make sure that the right approach is being taken, to make sure that risks are being taken, risks are being identified, and frankly make sure action is being taken, because some of the information that I see that disturbs me, particularly some of the issues around the knife crime identified in this case, is strong enough action was not taken, and we need to make sure that it is to keep people safe.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary very much for her statement, for her tone and also for her well-chosen words. I don't think there's any of us in this chamber, Madam Deputy Speaker, that our hearts don't ache for the families and their loss. The trust of the local communities and the information that was released was damaged, and a lesson on transparency, I believe, must be learned. So can the Home Secretary outline how government will ensure that trust is rebuilt in this system and that misinformation can be corrected and that those corrections are trusted in the future to come? Thank you so much.
Home Secretary.
The honourable member is right to raise the issue around trust, because we have an important issue around the police and criminal justice system are rightly independent of government and of politics, but there needs to be trust in the work that they do. It's why this government's made it part of our mission to restore confidence in policing, for example, which had been, I think, undermined for far too long, and to stand up for the rule of law and the role that the different parts of the justice system rightly play, which are different and which need to be defended, otherwise they will not provide justice for people in the future. And crucially, in order to ensure that there is trust, we need to get to the truth about what happened in this truly shocking, terrible case, what went wrong, and why a dangerous man was able to do this, able to commit this terrible crime.
above all, for all of us, should be to keep in our minds and in our hearts 3 little children and their families and all those who've been affected by this truly appalling attack. Make sure we get them the truth and answers, and also make sure that we can do everything we can to prevent such terrible crimes.
Can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement and ask that members who are planning to leave the chamber do so quickly and quietly. Presentation of Bill. Zara Sultana.
Arms Trade Inquiry and Suspension Bill.
Second reading, what day?
Friday, 14th of March.
Friday, the 14th of March. Which brings us to the 10-minute rule motion. Katie White.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to prohibit the practice of bottom trawling in marine protected areas in England and for connected purposes. It is a privilege to speak today on a topic that has cross-party support and builds on the excellent work being led by my colleagues, the ministers at DEFRA, to put nature on the road to recovery and address the climate crisis. This government and this parliament are the greenest of my lifetime, and I'm proud to be a member of a party with such a distinguished history of leading on environmental protection. This bill offers an opportunity for a fairer, greener future, and I'm grateful for support from colleagues across the House for the bill today. It's important to remember that protecting our oceans and marine protected areas is not only a Labour legacy, but a Yorkshire one. In 2009, my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds South, and then Environment Secretary, spearheaded the passage of the Marine and Coastal Access Act, a landmark act that established a network of marine protected areas to safeguard vital marine habitats, species and ecosystems. 15 years later, with a new Labour government in place, we have the opportunity to strengthen protections for these areas even further. Before I lay out my case to the House, I must address the obvious question: why is the MP for Leeds North West, a landlocked constituency in the heart of West Yorkshire, bringing forward a 10-minute rule bill to ban bottom trawling in our marine protected areas? It's a fair question. After all, up in Leeds, our closest encounters with marine life might be spotting a trout in the River Wharf or enjoying fish and chips on the drive back from Whitby. Yet the health of our seas is not just an issue for coastal constituencies. It is a national responsibility. The ecosystems in our waters play a crucial role in regulating the planet's climate, absorbing carbon dioxide and supporting biodiversity that impacts life far beyond our shores. From sheltered sea locks to wild open waters, from seaweed beds to deep water coral, the UK coasts and seas are extraordinary. They are home to an astonishing variety of wildlife, including dolphins, whales, sharks, seals, puffins and deep-sea coral reefs. They are also vital to our economy and communities, particularly our essential fishing industry, as well as our tourism, shipping and the growing renewable energy sector. As an island nation, we are never more than 70 miles away from the sea here in the UK. Whether it's pollution, habitat destruction or the impact of climate change, we Brits are deeply connected to our coastal heritage. And while our seas work hard for us, they face growing pressures, and bottom trawling is one of the most destructive practices of all. For members unfamiliar, destructive bottom trawling involves dragging heavy nets and metalwork across our seabed, destroying fragile ecosystems and habitats that take decades or even centuries to recover. As a fellow member so aptly put it to me, it's like ripping up an orchard to pick an apple. Just 1 or 2 trawls over an area can decimate the seabed for up to 5 years. And alarmingly, this is happening right now across our marine protected areas, zones specifically we've designated to safeguard and recover biodiversity. My bill builds on previous work to ban this practice. As it stands right now, only 5% of the UK's marine protected areas have a ban on this destructive practice. And my argument to members today in support of this bill is threefold. First, the British public overwhelmingly expects a ban. Second, our small fishing businesses are suffering without a ban. And third, it is crucial for the ongoing health of ecosystems within marine protected areas and the broader protection of the environment and the natural world in which we in Britain take great pride. First, the British public. Research from Oceana shows that this measure has significant public backing, with 8 in 10 UK adults in favour of banning destructive bottom trawling in marine protected areas. What's particularly striking is the level of misunderstanding around this issue. When surveyed, the vast majority, around 64%, mistakenly believe that such a ban is already in place. Many of the individuals I've spoken to within recent weeks share this same misconception, and frankly, it's no surprise. The term protected in marine protected areas naturally leads people to assume that harmful activities like destructive bottom trawling are prohibited. In reality, it's quite the opposite. These fragile ecosystems remain exposed to one of the most destructive forms of industrial fishing, which devastates habitats and wildlife. Secondly, I want to talk about our British fishermen and women, especially the small-scale fisheries that have been at the heart of our coastal communities for generations. Let's be clear, it's not our hard-working British fishermen who are dragging heavy nets across the seabed, destroying delicate ecosystems. The culprits are industrial-scale operations and super trawlers that prioritise profit over sustainability, leaving our own small-scale fishers to bear the brunt of their actions. This is David versus Goliath, a fight to protect the lifeblood of our coastal communities from the destructive might of industrial fishing giants. In 2023, just 10 fishing vessels over 20 metres in length were responsible for over a quarter of the destructive bottom trawling. None of these 10 vessels were from the UK. I won't pretend to be an expert on the fishing industry. However, Philp, a fisherman with decades of experience, puts it best. He describes how small-scale fishers are under a lot of pressure everywhere, but mostly from industrial fisheries. He says one of the things that impacts quite heavily on small-scale fishers is a highly degraded ecosystem, because many small fishers are only viable in a healthy, productive ecosystem. And Philp speaks for many in our fisheries who want stronger protections that ensure their livelihoods are not sacrificed for the short-term gain of large industrial operators. Protecting our 178 English marine protected areas from destructive bottom trawling is not only about safeguarding marine life, it's about securing a sustainable future for the communities who depend on our seas for their way of life. And lastly, and most importantly, we need to protect and restore our marine protected areas for both climate and nature. Bottom trawling isn't just destructive and emissions heavy, it reduces carbon sequestration. Our oceans are unsung climate heroes. A series of recent reports from WWF, RSPB and Wildlife Trust has found that the UK seabeds play a quiet yet crucial role in carbon sequestration, storing up to 13 million tonnes. That is nearly 3 times the amount captured by UK forests. This is not inevitable in England, and we don't need to imagine the positive impacts of this bill. We've already seen the benefits of banning bottom trawling in some of our marine protected areas. Take Lyme Bay on England's south coast. In 2008, a partial ban on destructive fishing practices was introduced. This was later expanded to 312 square kilometres, about 120 square miles, through overlapping conservation efforts. And the results have been quite extraordinary. The seabed has begun to recover, with coral reefs like pink sea fans regrowing, scallop numbers increasing, and species such as black bream returning to the area. Within just a decade, the number of species in the protected zone increased by nearly 40%, compared with a 5% decline outside. Local fishermen, such as Matt Toms, have witnessed these changes firsthand, and since destructive bottom trawling was banned, he's observed a lot more fish in the area, including black bream breeding in the bay once again. This is proof that protecting our marine ecosystems benefits not only the environment, but also the communities who rely on it. Lyme Bay is living evidence that with the right action, recovery is possible. And I think this and every other measure should be guided by the science. Sometimes people fail to act because they cannot see what is going on beneath the ocean. That's something that can't be said of our national hero, Sir David Attenborough. And I would like to thank him for his years of service to documenting our planet. I'm excited to hear that he is premiering a new film that draws attention to the damage that we have caused and the opportunities to humanity, in particular fishing communities, of well-managed and protected oceans. I'd also like to thank the Blue Marine Foundation, Oceana, WWF and many other activists across the country for their work on this. To close, as I have said previously, I came into politics from a background in climate and nature. I proudly campaigned for the Climate Change Act in 2008, a landmark act brought in by the last Labour government. It taught me from the outset of my career what could be achieved through a sustained, steadfast commitment to a cause. That act has succeeded because of its pragmatism and cross-party consensus. For this reason, I am proud of the cross-party nature of this bill and its co-signatories. I stand before you today to argue that the implementation of this bill is a matter of common sense. For the small fisheries of this country, for the wildlife in our marine protected areas, and for all of us who depend on a healthy planet. This bill is about real action on climate and nature, and I hope colleagues will join me in seizing this opportunity.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Anna Geldard, Mr Toby Perkins, Miss Polly Billington, Alistair Strathern, Luke Murphy, Sarah Champion, Afra Brandreth, Mr Andrew Mitchell, Wira Hobhouse, Carly Denyer and myself, Madam Deputy.
Katie White.
Marine Protected Areas Bottom Trawling England Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 20th of June.
Friday the 20th of June. Motion number 2 on arbitration bill. Lords, Minister to move.
I beg to move.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Armed Forces Commissioner Bill, not amended in the Public Bill Committee, to be considered.
No.
We will begin with new clause 1, with which it will be convenient to consider other new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper. I call Helen Maguire to move new clause 1.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move new clause 1. This is an important bill and one that I and my Liberal Democrat colleagues broadly welcome. However, it's one that we believe can and must go further. Before turning to the detail of our proposed changes, I want to acknowledge the significance of this legislation and the opportunity it presents to deliver meaningful change for the armed forces community. I thank the Minister and his team for all the hard work they've put into bringing this bill to the House. The Armed Forces Commissioner, as proposed in this bill, will serve as an independent and vital advocate for service personnel and their families, reporting directly to Parliament. This role is long overdue. For too long, service personnel and their families have felt neglected, overlooked and unsupported. The Commissioner's remit will include addressing a wide range of issues, from unacceptable behaviours and substandard housing to equipment concerns. The power to visit defence sites unannounced and commission reports is particularly welcome, as is the consolidation of the Service Complaints Ombudsman's responsibilities into this more robust role. The Liberal Democrats welcome these provisions as steps in the right direction, but steps alone are not enough. Delivering a fair deal for the armed forces community is not just morally right, it is a strategic imperative. Recruitment and retention challenges directly impact our national security. We cannot allow systemic neglect to erode the morale, trust and effectiveness of those who defend our nation. Time and again, reports like the Haythornwaite and Atherton reviews have highlighted the failures of previous governments, failures to provide decent housing, support service families adequately, or tackle issues like discrimination and sexual harassment. These are not new revelations, they are systemic problems that require a new approach. The former Conservative government failed to deliver for our armed forces. The Liberal Democrats will continue to call for a fair deal, including strengthening the Armed Forces Covenant, ensuring that service accommodation is fit for purpose and delivering for those who put their lives on the line for our country. This bill is an opportunity to begin addressing these issues comprehensively, and I'm proud to propose amendments that will ensure it delivers for all members of the Armed Forces community. I turn to New Clause 1. This seeks to extend the Commissioner's remit to include individuals going through the recruitment process. At present, the bill excludes these individuals, but recruits can face challenges during this initial formative stage. Recruits can be asked to stay on bases overnight, and we cannot ignore that they may encounter issues during such trips. It is essential to understand these issues to retain these recruits, as many currently drop out. We assume this is due to the long waits that they are currently experiencing, but it may also stem from issues that we are unaware of. This new clause would ensure that support is available from the very start of their journey into the armed forces, not just after they sign on the dotted line. Our Amendment 1 addresses another critical omission in the bill. The current bill leaves the definition of relevant family members to the government, which creates ambiguity and risks exclusion. Our amendment would ensure that kinship carers and the family members of deceased service personnel are explicitly included. These groups face unique challenges, and it is vital that they are not left behind. The creation of the Armed Forces Commissioner is a positive development, but we need to ensure the role is truly independent, adequately resourced and held to account for its actions. Several key issues must be addressed to guarantee the Commissioner's effectiveness. For the Commissioner to function properly, they must have adequate financial and practical support. Without sufficient resources, the Commissioner will struggle to fulfil their vital responsibilities. Our Amendment 3 places a direct duty on the Secretary of State to ensure that the Commissioner's office is properly resourced, both financially and practically, to carry out its work effectively. This ensures that the role is not hampered by a lack of support. Additionally, transparency and accountability are essential. If the Commissioner is to be a meaningful advocate for service personnel and their families, their work must be open to scrutiny. Our Amendment 4 requires the Commissioner to publish annual reports to Parliament, ensuring that their efforts are transparent and that they can be held accountable for their actions. These reports will allow Parliament, the public and service personnel to understand the welfare issues faced by service personnel and their families. To further safeguard the independence and credibility of the Commissioner, our Amendment 5 would have their appointment to be subject to pre-appointment scrutiny by a Parliamentary Select Committee. This process would allow members of Parliament to ensure that the best person for the job is appointed. This person needs to be independent of government influence and focused on the needs of the Armed Forces community. This additional scrutiny will help safeguard the integrity of the role and ensure it remains focused on the needs of the Armed Forces community. Further, the Armed Forces Covenant should be central to the Commissioner's work. The Covenant is a fundamental framework that guides how we treat our service personnel and their families, ensuring fairness and respect in all aspects of their lives. Our Amendment 7 would enshrine the Covenant's principles in the Commissioner's remit, ensuring that these values remain at the heart of their mission. Given the Covenant is at the heart of how we support our armed forces, it should be explicitly included in this bill. And it is essential that we do not delay putting this bill into action. That is why our Amendment 6 would require the Secretary of State to publish a timeframe for the appointment of the Commissioner within 6 months of the passing of the Act. Our armed forces and their families need this service urgently and cannot wait around for years for action to be taken. Following the damning findings of the Atherton and Etherton report, it's clear that minority groups, including women, ethnic minorities, LGBT+ personnel and non-UK nationals, face systemic challenges within the armed forces. The Atherton report, published in 2021, focused on the experience of women in the armed forces. 4,000 female service personnel and veterans completed a survey to inform the inquiry. Shockingly, 62% of respondents had been victims of bullying, discrimination, harassment, sexual assault during their service, sometimes at the hands of senior officers. It's unacceptable that women who serve in the armed forces too often face sexual harassment or misogyny. This issue has not been adequately addressed, reflecting a lack of moral courage within parts of the armed forces, despite good intentions across the services. Our Amendment 2 would require the Commissioner to take specific action to consider and address issues facing service personnel from minority groups, not only for our female service personnel, but also for those who are BAME, LGBT+, or not from the UK. This would be backed by annual reporting to ensure transparency and accountability. This is essential to ensure that all voices are heard and no one in the armed forces community is overlooked. In conclusion, this bill must be part of a wider effort to improve the quality of life of service personnel and their families. Housing, for instance, remains a persistent issue. Decent housing is not a privilege, it's a right, and service families deserve homes that are safe, comfortable and fit for purpose. Just last week in this House, my colleague, the Honourable Member for Taunton and Wellington, tabled an amendment to the Renters' Right Bill to extend the Decent Home Standard to the Ministry of Defence Service Family Accommodation, ensuring that all members of the armed forces have the living standards they deserve. I was beyond disappointment when the government voted this down. This bill represents progress, but is not the finished article. Although I do not wish to push new Clause 1 to a vote, our proposed changes are about fairness, accountability and doing right by all those who serve and their families. Let us seize this moment to deliver real and lasting change for the armed forces community. They have given so much for us. It's time we gave back to them.
Applicability to prospective recruits.
The question is that new Clause 1 be read a second time. Tan Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise today primarily to address Amendment 5, which the spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats just alluded to, which directly impacts the role of the Defence Select Committee, which I have the honour and privilege to chair. Amendment 5 proposes to enshrine in law an enhanced version of Select Committee pre-appointment scrutiny. This is significant because, in most cases, such scrutiny is a matter of political agreement rather than legislation. The government has committed to pre-appointment scrutiny by the Defence Committee for the preferred candidate for Armed Forces Commissioner. This mirrors the existing arrangement for the Service Complaints Ombudsman, the only defence-related post currently subject to this form of scrutiny. The Defence Committee last conducted such a hearing in December 2024, the current Ombudsman. So it's likely that our scrutiny of the Armed Forces Commissioner candidate will be both our first and final pre-appointment hearing in this Parliament. Let me clarify, Madam Deputy Speaker, the purpose of pre-appointment scrutiny. It aims to examine the quality of ministerial decision-making and appointments, assure the public that key public appointments are indeed merit-based, demonstrate the candidate's independence of mind, and bolster the appointee's legitimacy in their role. It's crucial to understand that this process does not replicate the recruitment process. We cannot assess the candidate pool or suggest alternatives. Our primary task is to evaluate how the preferred candidate performs under public scrutiny. In the Public Bill Committee, the Minister for the Armed Forces... yes, I will give way.
I thank the Chair of the Defence Select Committee for giving way. Does he not agree with me that it's not merely a question of scrutiny, but actually of approval? If the Defence Select Committee, which he so ably chairs, decides that the persons brought before them are not fit for that role, then is it not up to the Secretary of State to go and find somebody else who can pass the approval of the Select Committee?
I thank my honourable friend for his kind words, and indeed he has made a massive impact within the workings of the Defence Committee, of which he is himself a member. The very point that he has raised, that is precisely the issues that I will be coming into very, very shortly. So patience is a virtue, but I will definitely directly address what my honourable friend has just said. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the Public Bill Committee, the Minister for the Armed Forces stated that our scrutiny should be vigorous and thorough. I assure the House that given appropriate time and opportunity, it will be exactly that. The Minister also expressed expectations at committee stage for our scrutiny to go above and beyond the current process. I see clarity on this point from the Minister. So how does the government envisage the Defence Committee exceeding the current process without procedural changes? I would appreciate if the Minister could elaborate on this particular matter. Does the government have specific proposals to enable us to go above and beyond? My second question for the government is about implementation, which is the subject of Amendment 6. Following a pre-appointment hearing, the Defence Committee will recommend either appointing or rejecting the preferred candidate. For this process to be meaningful, the implementation plan must account for the possibility, however remote, of the Secretary of State facing a negative committee opinion, as my honourable friend just alluded to. The Service Complaints Ombudsman has informed us that under current legislation, casework processing halts without an ombudsman in post. We must avoid a scenario where rejecting a candidate would so severely impact service personnel, the ombudsman team, and the broader transition that approval becomes the only viable option. I seek assurances that this consideration is already part of implementation planning. So I hope that the Minister will elaborate on that particular point. The Ombudsman, Madam Deputy Speaker, also raised broader transition concerns in her evidence to the Defence Committee just last week. I trust the Minister is aware of and seriously addressing these issues. Other amendments before the House address the Commissioner's independence, which the Liberal Democrat spokesperson alluded to, minority group experiences in the armed forces, and the scope of the Commissioner's remit. These echo questions our committee has raised with the Secretary of State in our published correspondence. I hope that the government will carefully consider these points, regardless of whether they accept the specific amendments. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I eagerly await the Minister's responses to my two questions. How does he expect the Defence Committee to go above and beyond the current pre-appointment scrutiny process? And can he assure the House that the implementation plan accommodates the possibility of needing to extend the recruitment process and will not be put at risk if the Defence Committee recommends against appointing a candidate? Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
No, he wants to go afterwards. I'm sort of waiting for somebody to call. David Chadwick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I stand today in support of Amendment 2 proposed by the Honourable Member for Epsom. As the Member of Parliament for Brecon, Radnor and Cwmtower, I am proud to represent a constituency with a deep and enduring military history. It is home to Brecon Barracks, the headquarters of the British Army in Wales, and the 160th Welsh Brigade, alongside the Senny Bridge training area, where thousands of British service members train in the Brecon Beacons. My constituency is also home to a vibrant Nepalese community, made up of former Gurkha soldiers and their families, an integral part of our community's fabric. Gurkhas, renowned across the world for their bravery, professionalism and humility, have called the Brecon area home for over 50 years. They've settled here during their distinguished service in the British Army and have since become an invaluable pillar of our local society. In fact, Brecon is now proudly twinned with Dampus in Nepal, symbolising the bond between our two nations. However, it is the past treatment of Gurkhas in the UK that compels me to support this amendment. Despite their service to the United Kingdom, the Gurkhas have faced significant discrimination for many decades. Many will remember the Gurkha Justice Campaign, which gained momentum thanks to the tireless efforts of Dame Joanna Lumley and the support of the Liberal Democrats under Nick Clegg. It was through this campaign that a crucial parliamentary vote was won, granting all Gurkha veterans the right to reside in the UK, despite opposition from the Labour government of the time. But it wasn't only residency rights where the Gurkhas faced discrimination. They faced inadequate support after leaving active service, receiving less pay than their British counterparts for the same jobs, and many were deprived of fair pensions. Even today, veterans who served before 1997 continue to struggle for equal recognition and treatment. It's my firm belief that this amendment, especially the call for the Armed Forces Commissioner to produce annual reports on the challenges faced by specific groups and to establish mechanisms for community engagement, will help ensure that no group ever has to suffer injustice like the Gurkhas ever again. And I urge all members to join me in supporting this vital amendment.
Luke Akehurst.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've rise primarily to talk about Amendment 2 from the honourable lady from the Liberal Democrats. It was an honour to serve on the Bill Committee, and I would actually have spoken about Amendment 2 had it been moved at the Bill Committee. It was in the papers, but I think there was a timetabling issue that meant that it couldn't be moved in the committee. There's actually already a public sector equality duty under the Equality Act 2010 that would apply to the Commissioner. When the Commissioner was undertaking their reports, they would be bound by that duty to have due regard to the different minority groups that form the armed forces and their families. In terms of more specific thematic reports in relation to issues faced by minorities in the armed forces, that ought to be a matter for the Commissioner to decide. I'm also perturbed as someone with a disability myself, the absence of disabled people from the list of minorities that's cited. I think that that's the problem when you start to table amendments with a prescriptive list of different minority groups, that you can miss out groups and make some groups feel that their concerns might be more valued than others, and it's not completely incompatible with service in the armed forces to have a disability. Clearly, some physical disabilities make service on the front line difficult, but there are other roles that people with legally defined with a disability or self-identifying as having a disability might be able to serve in. And indeed, the most famous admiral in the Royal Navy's history was Horatio Nelson, who had two disabilities. He had one arm and one eye. So I think it's unfortunate to have gone for the prescriptive listing, and in any case, for the reasons I set out at the start of my remarks, unnecessary. I won't detain the House with my take on some of the other amendments, because I'm sure there are other honourable members that will wish to come in on those clauses, but my general assessment would be that I feel that the list of clauses that have been, of amendments that have been moved are well-intentioned but unnecessary, because the face of the bill already deals with the concerns that are being raised.
Jim Allister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is good to see the Armed Forces Commissioner put on a statutory basis, to see the functions set out, to see how that staff, though perhaps not directly recruited, can be provided for the Commission, and all that is good. But that causes me to think, yes, we're making provision for our current serving members of the armed forces. Why are we not making parallel statutory provision for our veterans? Why is it that it's right to have a statutory basis for the Armed Forces Commissioner, but not to have a statutory basis for the various veteran commissioners? Surely, if it's right for serving members, it must equally be right to have a statutory basis setting out the functions, ensuring staff provision for the veterans commissioners. I take the case in the part of the United Kingdom I know best. We have a part-time, term-appointed veterans commissioner.
Bristol